and that the webinars are then posted on our YouTube channel. So we have our channel on the Beef Reproduction Task Force on YouTube. We also have a Facebook account and a Twitter account that we try and post things that are related to beef cattle reproduction. And so if you don't already follow us, we highly encourage you to do so. It's probably the best way to keep up with things that we're doing and new programs that we have coming up. Today, our speaker is Dr. Shelby Rosasco. Shelby is a new member that joined the Beef Reproduction Task Force last year. We're really excited to have her in the team. A new face. Shelby is a fresh out of grad school professor now, assistant professor, University of Wyoming. It's really nice to get people like her that are excited and are passionate about beef cattle reproduction to join our team. Shelby was trained in New Mexico. We're just kind of joking around how things are probably not very green around, but New Mexico this time of the year, but it's probably not green most places around the US. But Shelby, it's a pleasure to have you here. We're excited to your first webinar, and I want to open the floor to you. While you're sharing your screen, before you say hi, I just want to make sure everybody understands that if you have questions, you can enter your questions in the Q&A tab, but please don't enter them in the chat because it's a little bit harder for us to monitor those questions. And we'll have time at the end of the webinar to then go over as many questions as we can. So please, as you have any questions, just type them on the Q&A, okay? And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Shelby. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Vitor. I'm assuming my screen is looking right on your guys' end. Okay, awesome. Thank you for that introduction, Vitor. I'm excited to be a new member on the task force, and it's really a pleasure to get to present this evening. I thought a lot about what I wanted to talk about, and really one of my favorite things to talk about is heifer development. That's what my research focuses on, and heifer development just gets me very excited because they're the future of our herd. And so my talk tonight is going to focus on nutritional management of replacement heifers and how we can use nutrition as a tool to positively impact fertility and even cow longevity. So we know that as producers, one of the biggest economic decisions that you make each year is whether or not you're going to retain and develop replacement heifers. This is a big decision because you're not only putting a lot of time and money into developing these replacement heifers, but it's also a big decision because how we manage these heifers during that first year of life can have a big influence on heifer performance and reproduction, as well as play a key role in establishing heifer fertility. And so I always like to start out when I start thinking about heifer development or give heifer development talks, kind of in general, and recognizing that each of your operations is going to be different. And so there's not necessarily one perfect way or one specific right or wrong way to develop our heifers. We need to come up with nutritional management strategies that fit within your system. So even though each of our operations are unique, there's still some central questions that we can ask ourselves when it comes to heifer development. The first one being, are we going to retain and develop our own heifers, or are we purchasing heifers? Now, there's certainly pros and cons to both retaining and purchasing heifers. My talk will obviously tonight focus on if we're going to retain heifers, how are we going to develop or manage these heifers, and how can we use nutrition as a tool to get these heifers to be successful. If we are buying, maybe we're buying weaned heifers or yearling heifers, and that's still going to give us an opportunity to positively impact fertility and help us pick out the right heifers. Then how do we select the right heifers? How do we walk out into that pen and pick out not only the heifer that looks the best, but the heifer that's going to have a high level of fertility? She's going to get bred early. She's going to wean a marketable calf, maintain a 365-day calving interval. How do we go out and pick that heifer? And we'll talk through a few things that you guys can think about when it comes to that. That last bullet point, break even for heifer development. I always think it's important for us to consider the economic side of our heifer development systems. We need to make sure that these heifers have the ability to break even and recoup their development costs and then start providing us a profit. Now I have 3+ years there on the screen because you can go through a variety of extension publications and research and find anywhere from 3 to 5 years. And there's even some recent papers out that show upwards of 8, 9, even 10 years for break even time point. Well, if it's taking us upwards of 8 or 9 years to break even on these heifers, we're not necessarily being quite as profitable in our system, and we maybe need to reevaluate. And that's where I do like to think of stocker operations like we would heifer development systems, like we would a stocker operation, where we're critically evaluating the inputs into our system and how long it's going to take us to turn a profit on those heifers.
Shelby, sorry to interrupt, but people are saying that they're having trouble hearing you.
Is that a little better?
It is. Thank you.
Okay. So when we're thinking about developing heifers and coming up with a plan, I think it's important that we think about the expectations we have for our heifers. So what are we expecting that heifer to do over the first couple years of her lifetime? Because we really are asking a lot for and putting a lot of pressure on her, especially from a reproductive standpoint. Now, the first thing on that list is that we need her to attain puberty prior to the start of her first breeding season. And that's really one of our rate limiting steps with our heifers, is that we need her to attain puberty so that she can become pregnant and hopefully lead into that next step, which is becoming pregnant in time to calve by 2 years of age. We then need her to calve without assistance and raise and wean a marketable calf. We're then going to ask her to rebreed as a first calf heifer and maintain a 365-day calving interval. And all of those different bullet points are going to lead towards that last one, which is that we want to maximize her lifetime productivity. And that doesn't just mean maximizing pounds of calf weaned or numbers of calf weaned over her lifetime. To me, that also means maximizing her fertility and reproductive performance and having her pass those genetics on. And so what we're really trying to do with heifer development is to select and develop a better, more productive cow. So we have to ask ourselves, well, how are we going to do that? And I think we can go through kind of a list of things that'll help us when we're thinking about how to select and develop that better, more productive cow. The first one being evaluating the current status of the herd. So in the past years, have we had issues with heifers attaining puberty prior to the start of the breeding season? We can utilize reproductive tract scoring. We know that if those heifers get to a reproductive tract score 4 or 5 before that first breeding season, that's going to allow them to get pregnant in that defined breeding season and be more successful. We can also evaluate pregnancy rates over the last couple years. If our pregnancy rates are low, that could be an indicator that we're having issues with puberty attainment. Maybe we need to bump nutrition up. Maybe we need to do some different things from a selection standpoint. If our pregnancy rates are acceptable, that's likely telling us that puberty attainment is probably at an okay level in our herd. But knowing these, the current status of our herd is going to help us when we're designing our heifer development systems moving forward. Now, we also want to consider selecting heifers that become pregnant early in the first breeding season, because we have really good data that shows that there's a difference between heifers becoming pregnant in a breeding season and becoming pregnant early in a breeding season. And we'll talk about that here in just a minute. We also want to consider nutritional management. That's going to be the focus of most of the rest of my presentation, is how we can use nutrition to get heifers to become pubertal, how we can utilize nutrition to positively impact fertility and longevity. And then that last one, reproductive management. Certainly there's a lot of really great presentations that the task force has put together on how to utilize reproductive management strategies like estrus synchronization and artificial insemination in our heifers to help us get those heifers set up right to be successful over the long term. Now, we said that there's a difference between getting a heifer pregnant in the breeding season and getting her early. And that's really based on this data set here. So Dr. Cushman and others from U.S. Meat Animal Research Center in Clay Center, Nebraska, put together this data set where they classified over 16,000 head of heifers by when they calved in their first calving season. So they designated heifers that calved in the first 21 days. That's going to be that green line on the slide. The second 21-day periods are between days 22 and 42. That's going to be the black line. And then anything that calved greater than 43 days into that first calving season, that's going to be the red line. And when we look at the longevity or the percentage of these heifers remaining in the herd over 9 calving seasons, what we see is that those heifers that calved early in their first calving season, so in that first 21-day period, have an increased percentage of heifers remaining in the herd over 9 calving seasons. And that can be really important from a longevity standpoint in her ability to recoup development costs and her ability to be productive for us. That's also really important from a fertility standpoint, because likely when those heifers that are getting bred early attained puberty earlier on, they were fertile at the beginning of the breeding season, and that's going to help us pass that trait on. Now, this is also really important from a productivity standpoint, because if we follow these same heifers out and look at average weaning weight of the calves of these heifers, what we see is that those heifers that calved in the first 21 days had an increased average calf weaning weight over their first 6 calves. And when we actually go through and add up all this additional weight that those animals weaned, they almost weaned 3/4 of a calf more over their lifetime. And again, that can be really impactful from an economic and a productivity standpoint. And so we have to consider, so how are we going to pick out these heifers that are able to get bred early? We can certainly utilize some different reproductive technologies. We can utilize ester synchronization to help sync those heifers up tighter at the beginning of the breeding season. We know that progesterone source can jumpstart cyclicity in some of our heifers, and that can certainly help. We can also consider if we need, maybe to keep 60 heifers as replacements, keeping 90 and limiting the length of the breeding season. And then anything that doesn't get pregnant in a short, maybe 45 or 30-day breeding season, those can be sold as feeder calves. We could also consider keeping extra heifers, and then at pregnancy determination, selecting only those heifers and identifying those heifers that got bred early, and then anything else that was bred later, those can be marketed as bred heifers. They're certainly going to fit in somebody else's operation. Now, I also want to consider that we can utilize nutrition to help push these heifers to have the best opportunity to get bred early. We can make sure that we're utilizing nutrition to ensure that heifers become reproductively mature and reach puberty. And we can also make sure we're monitoring nutrition during the post-weaning period and the post-breeding period to ensure that those heifers that do get bred early are able to maintain that pregnancy and be successful. Now, throughout the rest of the presentation, I want to focus more on the influence of nutrition on fertility and how we can use nutrition to our advantage when we're planning how to manage our replacement heifers. Now, a big part of this, and that I'm going to focus on, is this concept of developmental or nutritional programming. And so most of the time when we think about developmental programming, fetal programming is the first thing that pops into our mind. And that's certainly important. We have a lot of really great data that shows the benefits of fetal programming and targeted nutrition during gestation and how that can positively impact nutrition. But I want to focus on postnatal nutritional or developmental programming, because we have some really cool data that I want to talk through that shows that we can nutritionally program heifers during the first year of their life. So we can actually use nutrition to impact puberty attainment and potentially program the timing of the onset of puberty attainment. And we can also potentially program the ovarian reserve. So to start with puberty attainment, the answer to that question on the slide, can management decisions impact puberty attainment? Well, we certainly know that they can. We have really good data that show that we can impact puberty attainment with nutrition pre and post weaning. But when you really get into the data, we can see that we can have a pretty significant impact on timing of puberty and programming when puberty is going to occur with some pre-weaning nutrition. And so I want to focus on that for a few minutes, because what that shows us is that we have really important developmental windows early in life. That pre-pubertal period from 4 to roughly 8 or 9 months of age is a time point that we can target from a nutrition standpoint to ensure that our heifers have the best opportunity to attain puberty and even decrease the age of puberty attainment. Now, a good example of this is a study by Gasser and others in 2006. They were trying to answer the question of can early weaning hasten puberty. And so heifers were assigned to one of three treatments, either an early weaning high concentrate, where those heifers were weaned at 104 days of age and then fed a high concentrate diet from weaning through the start of the breeding season. The early weaning control, where those heifers were early weaned at 104 days of age and then fed a control diet, or the normal wean, where heifers were weaned at 208 days of age and then fed a control diet. Now, what was interesting was that the percentage of heifers pubertal and mean age, so the timing of puberty, was really similar between our early weaned control and our normal weaned heifers. We didn't necessarily have a significant decrease in the age at puberty attainment or hasten when puberty onset occurred. But in our early weaned heifers that were fed a high concentrate diet, we can see that there was a significant decrease in the mean age at puberty. So we were able to hasten puberty by targeting feeding a high concentrate diet earlier in life in these heifers. Now, this is important when we look at this next data set. So Cardoso and others looked at utilizing a stair-step nutritional regimen to program the onset of puberty attainment. So they utilized 40 crossbred heifers. There was some indicus influence in those heifers. All heifers were weaned at approximately 3.5 months of age, and then they were placed on one of 4 treatments, either a low control targeted to gain just over a pound a day, the high control targeted to gain 2.2 pounds a day, the stair-step 1, where they were on the high rate of gain from 3 to 6 months of age, step down to a low rate of gain from 6 to 9 months of age, back up to a high until 11 months of age, and then on a low. And then that final treatment was the stair-step 2 treatment, which was just the reverse sequence, meaning they started with a low, then stepped up to a high, and so on. Now, what's interesting is when we look at performance on these heifers, we can certainly see that even though they all started at that similar weight, our high control and then both of our stair-step diets reached roughly a similar body weight at the end of the treatment period. We can see periods of high and low gains in those stair-step treatments, depending on which portion of that stair-step system they were on. And they were all had an increased body weight compared to the low controls, which would be anticipated based on their gain patterns. When we look at the percentage of heifers pubertal over time and age of puberty attainment, we certainly see that the low controls had a decrease in the percentage of heifers attaining puberty and the age of puberty attainment compared to the high controls and the stair-step treated heifers. And we can also see that the high controls and the stair-step 1 treated heifers followed a similar pattern, with the majority of those heifers attaining puberty earlier on, between approximately 10 and 12 months of age. Now, while puberty attainment for the stair-step 2 heifers was delayed slightly compared to our high control and the stair-step 1, a majority of heifers on that stair-step 2 diet, and that's the dotted line, attained puberty between roughly 11 and 13 months of age. 70% of the heifers attained puberty between them. And this really suggests that timing of puberty can be controlled or manipulated by nutritional management. And so we know that we can impact nutrition based on when we feed these levels of a high concentrate diet or target nutrition in these heifers. Again, certainly that stair-step 1 diet, that increased nutrition between 4 to 6 months of age, had a greater influence on accelerating puberty, but we want to be cognizant that we don't have periods of precocious puberty, because that can certainly be detrimental to performance and not something that we recommend. Now, targeting a higher rate of gain between roughly that 6 to 9 months of age time point, again, targeted heifers to achieve puberty between roughly 11 and 13 or 14 months of age, which is really right when we want those heifers to achieve puberty, and we also avoided any increased incidence of precocious puberty. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on puberty attainment, because I think in our Taurus cattle, we certainly have done a great job selecting for puberty attainment and putting pressure on that trait. And we know that our British influenced animals have we don't have very many issues with puberty attainment. Certainly in our indicus animals, we maybe want to use some of these nutritional regimens. But again, if we're not having any issues with puberty attainment, maybe targeting those early pre-weaning time points isn't necessarily something that we need to do. So I want to switch gears and start talking about some post-weaning development strategies. Like I said at the beginning, every operation is different, and I think what's really great about heifer development is that we have a lot of different opportunities. You can see by the pictures here, these are all heifers in different development situations. We have heifers who are out grazing native range in New Mexico on the top left corner, heifers in a dry lot in two of the pictures, and then heifers out grazing nice green grass. That was summertime in Wyoming. But we certainly have options when it comes to grazing or developing heifers in the dry lot. And I don't think one is necessarily better than the other. It's what fits within your environment. Now, when we start talking about post-weaning nutritional management, we can't avoid the target body weight argument. And that really stems from heifer development research started as early as 1920s and 1930s. You can find research on heifer development and feeding heifers. But that research during the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s led to these guidelines that replacement heifers should reach 60 to 65% of their mature body weight by the start of the breeding season. Now, this is certainly a really safe number, and this number was targeted at getting a high percentage of those heifers pubertals prior to the start of the breeding season. And this is really important, especially if we're having issues with the percentage of heifers attaining reproductive maturity. This also really looked at maximizing pregnancy rates. But in some of our Western, more arid environments where we have extensive development systems, developing these heifers to that 65% mature body weight can be a real challenge from an economic standpoint with the amount of feed that we have to put in these heifers. Certainly with corn and feed prices the way they are this year, pushing these heifers to that 65% mature body weight can be a challenge in different areas of the country. And so this is where this little bit newer research started looking at, could we actually develop heifers to a lighter target body weight without impairing reproductive performance? And what was really cool about these studies was that they showed that we could actually develop heifers to closer to 50 to 55% mature body weight, or we could develop heifers out grazing, utilizing winter range or native range, and we could utilize corn residue as a way to reduce development costs, and we could still maintain reproductive performance in these heifers. And I don't think there's one right or wrong. Maybe I'm taking the middle road between the 65 and the 55 arguments, but I think what this does is it gives us as producers options for how we can develop these heifers. It gives us opportunities to consider what fits best within our production environment, within our system, to get heifers to meet the goals that we have for them. Now, some data that shows some differences, and that's going to highlight some of the pros and cons with each of the 55 or 65% mature body weight argument, is these data sets that came out of Nebraska. And so I've highlighted some studies that compared heifers either on a low gain or a high gain system. And what we can see is that, as we would expect, pre-breeding body weight is decreased in our low gain heifers. This does lead to some decreases in the percentage of heifers pubertal, and that certainly can be a limiting factor if we have, if we're really trying to push for those heifers to get bred early in the breeding season. And we also need to be considerate that these low gain systems put us a little more at risk. We're not quite as safe with how big these heifers are and getting these heifers to attain puberty and perform from a reproductive standpoint. But we also have a good example of a study with the Summers et al. Study from 2014, where we didn't see a negative or a decrease in the percentage of heifers pubertal at the start of the breeding season, and we're able to see no difference in overall pregnancy rates between our low and high gain heifers in each of these 3 studies. And in fact, the Summers et al. Study in 2014, we actually saw an increase in AI pregnancy rates in those heifers due to some periods of compensatory gain, and we'll talk about timing of gain and how we can utilize that here in a minute. But again, I think looking and comparing these low and high gain systems gives us options of how to develop our heifers. Certainly that 65% is a really safe number that's going to allow us to feel really comfortable with the reproductive performance we're going to get. But if we don't necessarily have the feed inputs or the resources We certainly can develop these heifers in more extensive environments to these lower percentage of mature body weight. Now, another concept I want to talk about for just a second is the influence of different nutrients on reproductive performance, and also thinking about how nutritional management is going to influence longevity in our beef heifers. And so Mullenix and others in 2013 did research in New Mexico at the Corona Range and Livestock Research Center there, where they compared heifers who were developed on native range and received a 50% RUP supplement or a 36% RUP supplement with heifers who were developed in the dry lot. Now, I don't have the reproductive performance listed here on the screen, but reproductive performance was really similar among all three of these treatments. Those range developed heifers on the 50% and 36% RUP supplements were certainly not limited by being developed on native range. But what was really cool was that they followed these heifers out through their 4th breeding season in this study. And they looked at the retention rate of these heifers. And what we can see is that we had some significant impacts of the dietary treatments on longevity, with that 50% RUP supplement having an increased proportion of heifers remaining in the herd through breeding year 4 compared to the 36% and the dry lot heifers. Now, I don't necessarily want to get into a full discussion on potentially why this 50% RUP supplement would have had an increase in retention rate, but I want to focus on comparing the 50% RUP heifers with the dry lot developed heifers, because I think there's a really important concept to get from this data, that those heifers on the 50% RUP diet that were developed out on native range may have been better adapted to their future production environment. They had an opportunity to adapt to that production environment, to learn how to perform in that production environment. And I think it allowed us to put some selection pressure on those heifers to be able to handle the nutritional stresses they were going to see that environment. And I think that's something to really keep in mind as we're planning how to develop our heifers, is that maybe developing heifers on range allows us to put selection pressure on heifers for their future production environment. So it allows us to pick out those heifers who can go out and handle the nutritional stresses and perform for us from a reproductive standpoint. Now I want to jump back into talking about some of the stair-step nutritional systems and really focus on the influence of timing of weight gain on heifer reproductive performance. Now, a really classic study that looks at this is the Lynch study from 1997. And in this study, they compared heifers who were developed on an even rate of gain from weaning through the start of the breeding season to heifers on a late gain system or a stair-step system, where they had a period of lower rate of gain the first half of the development period, and then were stepped up to a period of higher rate of gain the second half of that development period. Now, in this study, they certainly had differences in average daily gain. They had a nice compensatory gain response in those heifers from the March to the April time point, so during that increased rate of gain. And that was impactful because they suggested that heifers were more efficient at utilizing the feed resources they were provided during that time point. And that may have actually resulted in a decrease in development costs. But you can see that these heifers, whether they were on the even or late gain system, started at a similar body weight and ended at a similar body weight. So we still ended up at the same endpoint, regardless of the timing of gain during that post-weaning development system. And there was no difference in pregnancy rates in these heifers. And that was what was really cool, was that it allows us to get past this concept that heifers need to look good every time we go out and look at them in the pasture. We can actually delay gain in these heifers to later in the development period, allow us to save some money when winter feed costs are high, and then still get good pregnancy rates and reproductive performance out of these heifers. Now, the other thing that's really cool about this is we've done some recent research to actually look at these late gain or these stair-step type systems and how that impacts the ovarian reserve and reproductive longevity in our heifers. Now, to make sure we're all on the same page, when we're referring to the ovarian reserve, what we're really talking about is the population of microscopic or primordial follicles that make up the lifetime supply of eggs or oocyte that a mammalian female has. And so in the figure on this slide, you can see primordial follicles are the smallest follicle listed there. Those are those microscopic follicles that are going to be formed during gestation and represent the ovarian reserve. Now, the number of primordial follicles that these heifers have is set at birth. And as these follicles activate, they go through these different primary, secondary, and graphene or antral follicle stages as they're utilized by the animal. And again, we have always thought that the size of that ovarian reserve at birth is set, and then it's going to deplete at a constant rate over time, regardless of how we manage these heifers. Now, we've had some recent research that really challenged this, and we're going to go through that because I think it's providing us some good opportunities of how to manage our heifers. So the first study was from Freetley and others. So this was done at the USDA Meat Animal Research Center in Clay Center, Nebraska. And they wanted to look at comparing a stair-step development system with a constant gain system, so similar to that Lynch study, and what impact that had on the ovarian reserve. So following weaning, heifers were assigned to be either controls that were on a constant rate of gain during the post-weaning development period, or a stair-step development system. And these treatments were placed on these heifers in the dry lot. So they were fed individually in a dry lot. When we look at the end of the study, so what would be the start of the breeding season, when we look at the ovarian reserve by looking at the number of primordial or microscopic follicles, they actually saw an increase in the number of primordial follicles in the stair-step developed heifers compared to their control counterparts. And so this was really exciting because it was one of the first things in cattle that showed that we could potentially impact that ovarian reserve with nutritional management when those heifers are postnatal. Okay, so we're not impacting that ovarian reserve when those heifers are during gestation, when that ovarian reserve is forming. We're actually impacting those numbers when these heifers are in that peripubertal period while we're utilizing these stair-step nutritional systems. This was, again, really cool because it's suggesting that that stair-step system could potentially increase reproductive longevity in these heifers. Now, they followed this study up with this research by Amundsen and others in 2015, where they wanted to look at the timing of the stair-step development system. So when does this increase in the ovarian reserve occur? And so heifers followed the same protocol. They were developed in the dry lot and post-weaning. At 8 months of age, which would be initiation of treatments, they overoptimized a subset of these heifers and looked at primordial follicle numbers. They did a similar thing at 11 months of age. So this would be when those heifers on the stair-step treatment were ending that low rate of gain. They overoptimized a subset of heifers to look at primordial follicle numbers, and there was no difference in the number of primordial follicles at 11 months of age. But at 13 months of age, at what would be the start of the breeding season, we actually see that the stair-step heifers have an increase in the number of primordial follicles compared to their control counterparts. Again, suggesting that that delayed gain or that period of low, high nutritional nutrient intake in these heifers is potentially impacting the ovarian reserve and maybe positively impacting reproductive longevity. Now, from a biological standpoint, we don't necessarily know the mechanisms that are occurring, but we do speculate that maybe this stair-step development system is delaying activation of these primordial follicles. So it's slowing the rate that we're using these primordial follicles and would allow these heifers to have more primordial follicles to utilize over their lifetime. Now, one of the questions that I had during my PhD program was, well, this is great that we can utilize these stair-step systems in the dry lot, see this nice increase in primordial follicle numbers in the ovarian reserve, but can we actually do this in heifers out grazing native range? Because we know that there's a lot of producers who are developing heifers in a grazing situation. And so during my PhD, yes.
Sorry to interrupt again. It seems like the sound's getting a little worse again. I'm sorry.
I don't know what would be going on, but I'll try to keep talking loud. Is that a little better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So during my PhD, I had the opportunity to conduct some research at New Mexico State where we actually looked at utilizing these different constant gain and stair-step treatments in both the dry lot as well as in heifers who were out grazing native range. So we had 40 heifers. They were assigned to one of 4 treatments, either a constant gain dry lot, stair-step dry lot, or constant gain native range or stair-step native range. And then they were subjected to these treatments over a 90-day development period. So when we look at what the gains were over these time points, we actually used a little bit lower rate of gain. These heifers, knowing that we were in New Mexico, were targeted to reach roughly 55% mature body weight. And so heifers that were on the constant gain treatments in the dry lot and out grazing native range were targeted to gain 1.1 pounds per day. Heifers that were on the stair-step treatment were targeted to gain a little over a half a pound a day the first 45 days. Then they were stepped up to gain approximately 1.65 pounds per day the last 45 days. And then at the end of the 90-day development period, all of the heifers were overoptimized. When we look at body weight performance in these heifers, as we would expect, all of the heifers were similar body weight at initiation of treatments. But by day 45, we actually had a significant group effect where our native range heifers were actually outperforming our dry lot developed heifers. This was somewhat unexpected because those heifers were out grazing native range that was fairly low quality based on historic forage values. But this increase in body weight was actually maintained through the end of the 90-day development period. Now, we think those native range developed heifers outperformed their dry lot counterparts because we know in heifers out grazing native range, we certainly can't control intake in those heifers. And we also, those heifers can go out and do a really good job of selecting a higher quality diet than we can anticipate with clipped samples. And so they outperformed what we anticipated despite some of our best efforts with adjusting supplementation. But this is going to be important when we talk about the impact of these different treatments on fertility. So in addition to looking at the ovarian reserve, we also looked at some different fertility measures. Now, because we overoptimized heifers, obviously we couldn't look at pregnancy rates in these heifers, but we did look at what were dominant follicle diameters because we know that dominant follicle diameters can be an indicator of potential fertility of that follicle in these heifers. And so we saw a significant group effect where we had an increase in the dominant follicle diameter in our native range developed heifers compared to our dry lot developed heifers. Now, it's important to keep in mind that bovine follicles acquire ovulatory capacity at roughly 7 to 10 millimeters in diameter. So we certainly weren't limiting fertility in our dry lot developed heifers. But that increase in dominant follicle diameter in our range developed heifers suggested maybe that native range diet positively impacted fertility, because we know from data from Perry and others in 2007 that heifers ovulating follicles greater than 12.8 millimeters in diameter have an increase in pregnancy rates compared to heifers who ovulate follicles less than 10.7 millimeters in diameter. So again, we certainly weren't limiting fertility, but we may have had an increase in fertility in those native range developed heifers. Now, we also looked at follicular fluid hormone concentrations in these heifers, specifically when we focused on estradiol concentrations within the dominant follicle. We saw an increase in estradiol concentrations, and we know that follicular fluid estradiol concentrations can be an indicator of the ability of the oocyte to become fertilized. And so we likely had some increase in estradiol concentrations due to the bigger dominant follicle size, but that increase in estradiol concentration again suggests the potential increase in fertility in those native range developed heifers. Now, we also looked at the ratio of estradiol to progesterone, knowing that a ratio greater than 1 is indicative of an estrogen active follicle, which we know is important for, again, the ability of that oocyte to potentially become fertilized. And again, we had no differences between that. We certainly weren't limiting fertility in our dry lot heifers. We may have just had enhanced fertility due to the ability of those heifers to go out and select a higher quality diet than what we could anticipate. Now, when we looked at the effect of nutritional programming, those stair-step diets on the ovarian reserve, We were able to see similar results to Freetley and Amundsen, where we had an increase in primordial follicle numbers in our stair-step dry lot and our stair-step native range developed heifers compared to their constant gain dry lot counterparts. And this was really cool because it showed us not only could we repeat the USDA study in a new location in New Mexico, but that we could also supplement native range developed heifers on a stair-step regimen and still get an increase in primordial follicle numbers. Again, giving us more options for when we're deciding how to develop our heifers. Now, what was interesting was that our constant gain native range heifers were intermediate. They were similar to our constant gain dry lot, as well as both of our stair-step treatments. And really what this suggested was that dietary differences between the constant gain native range and the constant gain dry lot heifers potentially had an impact on the mechanisms controlling primordial follicle activation that we were altering with these nutritional treatments. And so, you know, it kind of makes me speculate that maybe because those heifers can go out and do a really good job on native range of kind of naturally following the stair-step development system as that grass greens up, maybe that diet when they're out on native range naturally follows this stair-step system, and we can utilize that to our advantage. Now, what's really cool about these stair-step studies is, again, these increases in primordial follicle numbers in the ovarian reserve may result in an increase in longevity. And Freetley and others have recently come out with some data where they actually looked at herd survival in stair-step heifers. So they compared herd survival between 300 heifers who were developed on a constant gain diet and 300 heifers developed on a stair-step diet. And what they saw was that by 6 years of age, there was a greater percentage of stair-step heifers remaining in the production herd who were still calving compared to their constant gain counterparts. So we're actually seeing a potential increase in reproductive longevity in these stair-step heifers. So not only are we potentially being more effective with this stair-step diet from a reducing development cost standpoint, but we're also potentially positively impacting reproductive longevity. Now, when we go through these studies, what's interesting about them is we don't see differences in the percentage of heifers that are pubertal by the start of the breeding season. We don't see differences in antral follicle counts, despite differences in microscopic follicle numbers. We can potentially attribute that to we're not following heifers out long enough in these studies to actually see that increase in antral follicle count. We know that that process from primordial follicle activation through antral follicle development takes roughly 100 days, and we're not following those heifers out long enough to see that. And that we also saw no difference in the date of conception as a heifer. So we're not negatively or positively impacting that conception date. So if fertility is improved in these stair-step, what could be the mechanisms controlling this? We certainly are currently looking at different mechanisms that would be controlling primordial follicle activation, but we're also starting to look at what these stair-step diets potentially do to circulating progesterone concentrations. Do we have any impacts on luteal phase progesterone concentrations, similar to what we see in animals born with higher antral follicle counts? And we're also looking at how the stair-step diet may impact uterine function. And so that's the study that's currently undergoing at University of Wyoming. I was really hoping to have some data done and ready for you guys to see this evening, but we just have had some issues with getting supplies in to complete some different parts of the study, and we're not ready to show it quite yet. But we're following the similar treatments to what I did in New Mexico. We're utilizing that same 90-day development period, but we are collecting blood samples to look at progesterone profiles and uterine biopsies to look at uterine function. And so I'm excited to hopefully be able to share that with you in the next year or so. Now, I would be remiss if I skipped over post-breeding nutritional management. This has certainly been a topic that Dr. George Perry has covered in past ARSBC meetings, as well as some of the webinars. So if you want a really in-depth look at post-breeding nutrition, I would encourage you to go back and watch and listen to those. But we do know that nutrition post-breeding is also really important, because alterations in plane of nutrition during the post-weaning period, so immediately after AI, can actually alter conception rates and embryo quality. And so when we look through some of the data, again, this certainly is not all inclusive of that data, but this data from Arias and others that was done at Purdue and University of Wyoming, heifers were developed in a dry lot and then immediately post-AI placed on either a positive plane of nutrition, so that's the gain treatment in the black bars, a diet to maintain weight, or a diet that was formulated for those heifers to lose some weight. And what we see is those heifers that were on a positive plane of nutrition had an increase in conception rates compared to the maintaining those heifers. Again, suggesting that we need to keep these heifers on a positive plane of nutrition in order to ensure that all the work we put into developing these heifers and getting them pregnant early is not going to waste. We see this again in this study from Perry and others in 2013. Heifers were developed either out on pasture, that's going to be those heifers in the black bars, or in the dry lot. Puberty attainment was similar among the two treatments. All treatments following AI, they were synchronized the same. All treatments following AI were then placed out on pasture. And what they saw was those heifers that were developed in the dry lot and then placed out on pasture after AI had a decrease in AI conception rates. So potentially that decrease in nutrition when they went from the dry lot out to pasture impacted AI conception rates and decreased those. And so we need to make sure that we're consistent with the nutrition pre and post breeding. If we are in a situation where heifers have to be developed in the dry lot and then have to go out to pasture or range following AI, we do need to consider that supplementation of heifers on pasture can provide the necessary nutrient intake to reduce decreases in conception rates. So providing supplement to those heifers or adapting them to that pasture before AI can help mitigate these decreased conception rates that we see. So hopefully I got you guys thinking about not only how nutrition can impact fertility at the start of the breeding season or going into that breeding season and during the breeding season, but what are the long-term implications of our heifer development systems? And so we know that we can have really big effects with nutrition during that first year of life, but we also need to consider the fact that the effect of post-weaning heifer development systems on longevity is complex. A lot of times it's not necessarily something we measure from a research standpoint. There's certainly some of us that are working on looking at that, but those kind of projects take a lot of time. And we also know that the environment and other management practices have a big impact on that. But that certainly doesn't mean don't look at longevity and how you're developing these heifers can impact that. Because if we're trying to push reproduction and fertility forward in our heifers and select for that, we know that from a genetic standpoint, those have really low heritability. But like I showed you throughout this presentation, we also know that management strategies and heifer development protocols can have a pretty significant impact on cow retention and fertility, and so we need to use those to our advantage. So just kind of to sum up, heifer selection and development is going to be unique for each operation. So my goal for this presentation was to give you guys some different things to think about from a nutritional standpoint of how we can target nutritional management for our heifers in the dry lot as well as out on pasture. We also know that decisions made regarding nutritional management of heifers can help us program puberty attainment, help us program fertility, and potentially help us program reproductive longevity and the ovarian reserve. We also need to be considerate that management decisions will affect overall productivity and longevity of our cow, because we know that fertility and longevity are not single stage events. Everything we're doing to these animals from a management standpoint is going to potentially increase fertility. So we need to continually think about fertility throughout the year. And we also know that these stair-step nutritional systems may allow for some increases in longevity. So maybe this is something we can add to our heifer development systems. And then that last one, consistency is key between that pre and post breeding nutritional management. So I just want to say thank you to the task force for letting me put together this webinar series. I'm sorry you've had some difficulties hearing me. I promise I'm talking as loud as I can, but I have been sick, so that might have been impacting a little bit. I'm happy to answer any questions in the question and answer box, but if we run out of time or you want to talk more in depth, I put my contact information on the slide. Don't hesitate to email or call me. I'm always happy to discuss things. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, Shelby. Yeah, I want to remind everybody, we have a Ask the Expert tab in our website. So, you can send questions at any time, and somebody from the task force will reply. And then if we don't have the answer, we can definitely share contact information of other people that we think might be able to answer those questions. I want to remind everybody too, please type your questions, not in the chat, but in the Q&A tab of the Zoom webinar. Okay, so Shelby, there's a lot of questions already here. I'm going to start with the first one. There's two. They're related to RUP. So I think if you don't mind explaining what RUP is.
Yeah, so I should have mentioned that when I was going through. RUP is referring to ruminantly undegradable protein. So that's our bypass protein. So you used to see it as UIP. Now we designate it as RUP just to make things confusing. But it's really just talking about the level of bypass protein. If you want to know specifically what was in that supplement, I'm happy to track down that paper for you. I don't have it memorized off the top of my head, but they were doing a higher bypass protein inclusion level in that supplement. So that level was at 50% compared to the other treatment, which was at 36% ruminantly undegradable protein or bypass protein.
Awesome. There's a couple of questions about the stair-step development method. So if you don't mind explaining that again to people what it is, and then after that, I'm going to ask some more specific questions.
Yeah, so that stair-step development system can really be, think of like a stair-step, right? We're going to have periods of higher rates of gain and periods of lower rates of gain. Specifically, what we're doing with these is we're having periods of a low rate of gain to start. Okay, so those heifers are on for the New Mexico State study, they were on 45 days on a lower rate of gain, so roughly a half a pound a day gain. And then we stepped them up to a higher rate of gain that's closer to a pound and a half or 1.6 pounds per day. So all three of those studies that I talked about from the stair-step standpoint did a low rate of gain, and then those heifers were stepped up to a higher rate of gain.
Awesome. There's a question. I don't know if you can open up and read as well from Ricky Resby. So about the stair-step development strategy. How do you think the results could be impacted when you're asking when the heifers to calving the first time? So for example, if you're going to set them up to do spring or fall, or late spring, for example, versus summer, do you have any information on that?
We haven't necessarily specifically looked at changing when the heifers are calving. I don't know that would have a huge impact on it. I think what we're really trying to do is target that peripubertal time point, so that time point right before those heifers attain puberty. We're hoping to hit that window, and that targeting that period of low nutrition during that window, followed by that high nutrition, seems to allow us to hopefully slow the rate of activation of those heifers. We don't necessarily think we're increasing the number of primordial follicles. We think we're just slowing how fast we're using those. But looking at some of these mechanisms, specific nutrition, specific timing is things that we want to do as we move forward. That way we can keep sharing with you guys how to implement this strategy and potentially utilize it to your advantage.
I think you kind of already answered this right now, but is a simple two-step growth phase better than constant gain?
Based on the data, I personally think so. I think we've had some really great data to show that we get similar pregnancy rates out of it, similar fertility from those measurable aspects. But we're also seeing some really great responses with a single phase stair-step system from that ovarian reserve standpoint. We're not limiting puberty attainment in those heifers, so we're not negatively impacting that. but we are positively impacting reproductive longevity. And I just think that is really cool that we are potentially doing that.
There's a question, and you shared later in the presentation. If you're going from a dry lot to pasture situation post AI, how long should you wait to do that, or how long should you prolong that supplementation post AI?
Dr. Perry's probably the expert on this one. That's been a big focus of his research. I think as long as you're keeping that nutrition plate positive, letting those heifers adapt out to that pasture. We know that when we take heifers out of a dry lot, put them on pasture, it increases their activity level, right? They unfortunately don't just put their head down and start eating. We're going to be moving around the pasture. A lot of times they're not used to being in a grazing situation, so that'll decrease nutrient intake. So my suggestion would be, 30, 45 days, keep that nutritional plane high as they adapt to that different diet.
There's a question about cooling heifers. I think, so at what age would you cool for weight gain, for example? What age would you cool for reproductive score? And can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, it's going to depend on kind of what your system is. I really like doing the reproductive track scores 60 to 45 days before the breeding season. That gives us time to make some culling decision. If we're having a problem, maybe reproductive track scores we have a lot of 3s where those heifers are getting close. Maybe that tells us we need to up our nutritional intake. We can use nutrition to try to rescue some of those heifers, right? Maybe we're too far on the edge of that low input type system. But I like doing that about 60, 45 days before the breeding season as we're starting to get things ready. So we can make some last minute decisions and we have some time to prepare.
There's a question about mineral supplementation and effects on reproductive tract development. Are you aware of any of that data?
I'm not specifically aware of a lot of mineral data. That's not necessarily my area of focus, but we do know that if we're providing a good mineral program for our heifers, that's going to help us. So I don't know that there's specific mineral programs or minerals we should target for that. I always just kind of preach, make sure you're meeting the mineral needs of those heifers. So be cognizant of what the mineral needs they have for the stage of growth and development they're at, and be having a mineral program that meets all of those micro and macro mineral needs that those heifers have.
There's a question from Jordan Thomas. Can you comment on late weaning? He comments, for example, it's not uncommon to see fall-born calves being weaned at 10 or 11 months of age in some parts of the country. Are you aware, how does that affect heifer development and performance?
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily late weaning is going to hinder reproductive performance. They're likely still in a pretty good plane of nutrition if they're still there with their dam or with their mother. I do think that can make some challenges with trying to target that peripubertal time point with the stair-step development system. We certainly need to make sure that they're still moving forward towards getting to the breeding season and being at an appropriate weight and having an appropriate percentage of those heifers reach reproductive tract maturity. So I don't think we're really hindering anything by late weaning. Certainly there's areas of the country where that's just how that production system is. But again, I think maybe it limits a little bit what we can do with some of the stair-step strategies to target that increase in ovarian reserve.
There's a question about developing heifers on rangeland versus dry lot, and what do you think are the biggest challenges and opportunities for both systems? So
that's a really great question. I think you guys are trying to get me to pick one or the other. I think there are some challenges there's pros and cons to both. Rangeland, I really like the opportunity to put selection pressure for heifers that can perform in those nutritional environments, because we know the rangeland is not perfect, right? Those, you can see the grass in the picture on the slide. That's New Mexico. There's not a lot of grass there. There is a tint of green. But I think there's some good opportunities to put selection pressure on heifers that can perform in limited nutritional environments, to let those heifers learn some grazing behaviors. I think what my PhD research kind of showed us was those heifers can perform really well. If we get a good green up in the spring, those heifers can outperform dry lot heifers that are on a limit feeding system. The dry lot, certainly we have a lot more control over the diet those heifers are getting. It gives us some more opportunities from a reproductive management standpoint. But I think if we're going to ask those cows to go out and perform as grazing cattle, there can be some, I don't want to say hindrance there, but they haven't had the opportunity to have as much grazing behavior and learn that. Certainly with the way corn prices are right now, the dry lot, that's gonna cost you some more money. But supplements on range right now aren't cheap either. So I think you can do some cost comparisons from there. Fertility wise, I think you could ask anybody on the task force, and we could probably argue it one way or the other, as far as if we think rangeland or dry lot is better. I think you can get adequate fertility out of both, especially if you're managing those heifers to make sure they're attaining puberty, to make sure that they're ready for that breeding season. So I hope that stayed the middle ground. I didn't really pick a side.
No, I think that was good. That was good. And there's quite a few questions still coming up about the stair-stepping and that method. There's a question about have you done the costs for some of have you looked at some of the costs when you look at the range versus the concentrate on the dry lot? Has any of that economic analysis, I guess, of both systems have been done so far?
So we have not looked at cost yet. Now, one of the main reasons we haven't looked at cost yet is because the diets have been different, and we've been really focused on looking at those ovarian reserve mechanisms and measuring that. And when I do the cost, I want it to potentially be a study where we follow those heifers out, we let them breed, and we're managing them like we would a normal heifer. When we're doing all these additional samples, when we're taking ovaries out, we're not necessarily managing the same. And so when I do that economic analysis, I want to be able to say this is the net cost for one pregnant heifer. These are what these different systems cost, and we're not necessarily to that point yet. It is in the plan for those studies as we move forward to start doing some of the economic analysis. That way, when we're telling you guys that we think these are going to decrease development costs, we can actually say, yes, they are decreasing development costs, or they're comparable, whichever way that's going to fall.
A couple more questions about the stair-step. Question from Randy. On the second step, when you're going to go, I guess, start going to high gain, when do you consider, at what age do you consider the puberty point so you can start that high gain phase?
So that's kind of a trickier one from the standpoint that if you look back, the studies that were done at USDA, they were a lot longer development periods. So the lower plane of nutrition was when those heifers were roughly 8 to 11 months of age. And then they were stepped up from 11 to 13 months of age. The New Mexico data, it was going to be meat feeding all alone. So we shortened that development period. And part of that was also knowing that the way they manage heifers at that ranch, they don't put a lot of input into them until later in the post-weaning development period. So that 90-day pre-breeding development period, they were farther along in their development. That's similar to what we did with the Wyoming data that I wasn't able to present tonight because we don't have done yet. But we brought that back. I think there is a step where we need to look at the specific timing. I do think it has to do with targeting a lower rate of gain, stepping up to that higher rate of gain right around that time, right before they hit puberty. So that could be you knowing, okay, my heifers generally, I notice them start riding each other, or I do reproductive track scores at these points. And I know that majority of my heifers are at a 4 or 5 at this point, or I see a lot of activity in my heifers starting at this point. That's likely when you can find those windows right before puberty and right after puberty to be targeting.
There's a question about total pounds of supplement fed, when those two methods versus like the constant gain versus the stair-step. Are they the same, similar, or different?
So without getting out my calculator, I would guess that the total pound of supplement was pretty similar between the constant gain and stair-step treatments. I think that'll be something when we do an economic analysis that'll come out as far as if we're actually decreasing the amount of feed we're using in the stair-step systems. Right, with the stair-step system, we are trying to target some compensatory gain, would have us be a little more efficient, but the NRC has a hard time calculating out what that compensatory gain would be like. So going off these NRC nutritional models, I would say we're probably pretty comparable with the amount of supplement we're utilizing over time.
Shelby, there's a question, and I don't know, have you ever looked at the mVigor score and correlated to any of your work on ovarian function?
I have not specifically looked at that. That's something that maybe we can add to some studies in the future, but we haven't done that in the past.
And it's an interesting question about when you develop those heifers using those high grain diets, whether or not you're causing a dependency as that cow mature to rely on those supplements to then maintain body condition score subsequently.
That's a really good question. I don't know that we're necessarily causing a dependency. I do think we have to be careful on those grain-based diets that we don't get them to a condition that they're never going to be at once we put them on pasture, right? There's some really good data that shows that, animals or heifers or cows that are at a higher body condition score, and then they dropped animals down to where they stopped cycling, it took them longer to start cycling again. So I think we need to be cognizant that even though we're targeting 65% a lot of times in a dry lot or a grain-based situation, the grain-based diet, I don't think it's negatively impacting or creating dependency. I think we just have to be careful with what condition we get animals to. We don't necessarily need to feed them like they're in a feedlot on an ad libitum diet, right? We can limit feed animals in the dry lot and still get good performance. And we can still use a lot of roughage-based diets, feeding a grass hay versus a silage. We can do different things to not necessarily stop dependency, because I don't think we're dependent on grain, but to decrease and make sure we're keeping that body condition in control.
We'll do a last question here for the sake of time. And I'm going to combine two questions in one. There was being a lot of questions about the stair-step system, and specifically, that transition them from going to a dry lot, high grain type diet, and then transition to a grass, forage type diet after breeding. How does that impact early embryonic death or mortality, for example, early embryonic loss and fertility?
So I think if we're using the stair-step diet right, those heifers are still hopefully on a positive plane of nutrition at the start of the breeding season. Like I said, we want to avoid dropping nutrient intake or dropping average daily gain in those heifers in that breeding season, and that's regardless of if they were on a constant rate of gain, if they were in a dry lot, if they were on pasture. If they were on pasture and getting a supplement, and then we stop giving them a supplement, that's going to decrease nutrient intake. It's going to decrease average daily gains. Maybe won't have as pronounced of an effect, because maybe we won't see as significant as a decrease. But we certainly know that we have some embryonic death. We're having some decreases in conception because they're having nutritional stress during those time periods. So I don't necessarily think it's a problem with the stair-step diet or something like that. It's keeping that plane of nutrition consistent across pre and post breeding. I hope that kind of answered the question. I know it was a longer one.
No, that was great. Thank you very much, Shelby.
Yeah, no
Very,
problem.
very nice. Yeah, very nice webinar. I think we picked 170 people, which is great. A lot of questions. So definitely a topic that, you know, has an interest, have people interested on. So thank you again. I appreciate you giving a webinar. I want to remind everyone this was recorded. We're going to post it on YouTube over the next few days. So if you haven't watched, if you missed part of it, or if you want to send somebody this to somebody that you think will be, you know, could benefit from watching this presentation, please make sure that you follow us on Facebook and Twitter so you can get updates whenever we post this on YouTube. And also remind everyone that the next webinar is going to be on March 15th at 7 p.m. Central Time with Dr. Philippe Muriel. I want to thank one more time our sponsor, Astrotech, and thank you everyone for spending the night with us. Shelby, thanks again. Have a good night. Thank you.